Racist woman broke a black elder's cane like it was just wood. Not memory, not legacy. Didn't see Big Shaq standing nearby, holding a camera, heart already breaking. What happened in that park wasn't just an insult. It was history repeating in plain sight. But this time, Big Shaq didn't walk away. Because when dignity shatters in silence, someone has to press record. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. Morning settled over the suburb like a gentle breath, warm and unhurried. The park, nestled between rows of pastel houses, with trimmed hedges and wind chimes, was already alive. Joggers paced in rhythm, earbuds in, sweat beading on temples. A young father chased a giggling toddler around the duck pond. Over by the benches, retirees unfolded newspapers like maps of a slower world. It was the kind of park where people nodded but didn't speak, waved but didn't stop. A safe, ordinary place, on the surface anyway. Sunlight stretched through the branches of maple trees that bordered the gravel path, dappling the concrete with flickering patches of gold. It gave the illusion of warmth, of safety, the kind of place where nothing ugly ever happened, the kind of place where people believed racism didn't live anymore, at least, not out in the open. But things live in silence too, and sometimes, silence is where they grow best. Down a path less traveled, slow steps tapped rhythmically against stone. Eleanor Briggs moved with grace, her shoulders drawn back in quiet resolve. Her cane, worn smooth with time, tapped lightly, not just an aid, but a part of her, an heirloom of love and history. Her dark coat billowed slightly in the breeze, her gray curls tucked beneath a soft brown hat. To anyone looking, she was simply an old woman out for a walk. But the way she moved, deliberate, composed, spoke of a woman who had learned long ago how to carry herself when the world tried to shrink her. Eleanor didn't demand space. She claimed it silently, the kind of presence that made noise in a room without saying a word. As she passed the flower beds lining the edge of the pond, she paused. Her eyes settled on a bluebird fluttering near the fountain. A soft smile tugged at the corners of her mouth. It was the kind of moment that deserved to last. Light, simple, untouched. That's when she noticed the stillness. A shift, quiet but undeniable, like the subtle drop in pressure before a storm. Not a sound, but a feeling. The air tightened. Across the path stood a woman, stiff, arms crossed over a sharp white blouse, dark sunglasses perched on her face even though the shade swallowed her. Her mouth was a hard line, the sort of face that watched everything and assumed the worst. The sort of woman who rarely spoke, but when she did it was always to say too much. Connie Harland. Not a stranger. Eleanor had seen her before, always walking fast, avoiding eye contact, lips twitching at the sight of neighborhood kids with brown skin playing too loud. But this time was different. Connie didn't walk on. She didn't move. Her eyes, obscured by the lenses, bore into Eleanor with a cold, steady pressure. There was no sound, just the park behind them, humming with distant laughter and rustling leaves. But the space between these two women had its own current now, one that buzzed without noise. Eleanor's cane tapped once more, and she started forward, her eyes flicking just slightly toward the woman before moving ahead. She didn't slow down. She didn't look again. Not because she didn't notice, but because she had learned, a long time ago, the difference between ignorance and provocation. The path narrowed briefly ahead, bending around the roots of a thick elm tree. Eleanor kept walking. So did Connie. Their paths crossed, an unspoken tension hanging in the air like static. Just as Eleanor moved to step around the other woman, something subtle changed. Connie leaned in slightly, just a half step, but enough to crowd the space, enough to make it clear this wasn't random proximity. It was confrontation, without words. Eleanor stopped, her hand resting lightly on the cane, the breeze catching the hem of her coat. Her breath stayed calm, measured. She didn't flinch. Connie's jaw shifted. The corner of her mouth twitched into something that wasn't quite a smile. Her lips moved, but her voice didn't carry. A whisper? A mutter? Eleanor didn't strain to hear it. She simply stood. Behind them, life carried on. A dog barked. A bike whirred past. Nobody saw what didn't look like anything. And that was the point. Eleanor took one step, then another. Then her cane caught on something. She stumbled, just barely, not enough to fall, just enough to jolt her balance. Her hand reached instinctively to the cane, but the feeling was wrong, lighter, off balance. She looked down. The wooden shaft, now cracked, trembled under her fingers. At first glance it looked like wear, like time, like a misstep, but Eleanor knew better. She'd felt the slight tug, the pressure. She'd heard the sound, quiet, purposeful, not an accident. She turned her head slowly, not out of fear but acknowledgement. Connie was already walking away. No apology, no glance back. Just that stiff, deliberate walk of someone who believed consequences didn't exist in sunshine. Eleanor stood still. Her hand tightened around the broken cane, the sound of distant laughter feeling suddenly misplaced. She didn't call out, didn't shout. She simply stood, the weight of years heavy on her shoulders, but not enough to bend her. People passed. A couple jogged by. Someone on a phone laughed too loud, but no one stopped. No one asked. They saw but they didn't see. In that moment, the park was still beautiful, but no longer innocent. A quiet storm had touched down. Unseen, unheard, but not unnoticed. Because someone had been watching. The sun still bathed the park in honey-colored light, but something beneath it had soured. The breeze had cooled just slightly, curling through the elm branches like a whisper that something had shifted. Birds still chirped. Children still played in the distance. But on the east path, where the wide gravel clearing opened like a small plaza between trees, time held its breath. Eleanor Briggs stepped cautiously into the clearing, her cane tapping with its familiar cadence. The crack in the shaft had weakened its support, but she walked with it anyway. It wasn't just a tool, it was memory. She'd kept it beside her through hospital visits, funerals, Sunday services, and front porch summers. Its presence was a comfort, even in its broken state. Her breath stayed steady, her spine upright. Dignity lived in her posture, not her pain. She was almost across the clearing when the figure emerged again. Connie Harland, arms stiff, eyes hidden behind mirrored sunglasses, jaw clenched like she had bitten down on something bitter and wouldn't let it go. This time she didn't just hover in Eleanor's periphery, she moved deliberately, stepping into Eleanor's path with the kind of entitlement that only felt natural to those who'd never been told no. Eleanor stopped. Not abruptly, not dramatically, just enough to acknowledge the obstruction. The space between them was charged, though no words had yet been exchanged. Around them, the park was alive, but the clearing itself had gone oddly still. The shade didn't quite reach this part of the path. The sun pressed hard here, casting sharp shadows and harsher truths. Connie stood with one foot angled, just slightly forward, blocking the natural way forward. It was a subtle move, one that could be explained away in polite conversation. But this wasn't that. Eleanor looked into the woman's face. Or rather what could be seen of it behind those sunglasses. The lines around Connie's mouth were tense, impatient. She was waiting for something. Perhaps expecting a retreat, a detour, a submission. But Eleanor didn't budge. You people always think the world owes you something. The words came low and clipped, carried just enough to be heard by the few passers-by within earshot. A young man with a stroller paused mid-step, glanced toward the sound, then turned the other way. A woman on a bench glanced up, recognized the tone, then looked back at her phone. It wasn't indifference. It was the fear of proximity to someone else's ugliness. Eleanor remained silent. Silence was not surrender. Silence was a shield. She had learned that some provocations were invitations to spiral, and she'd long since declined those. But Connie wanted more. Her voice rose, accusing, leaning into the discomfort of the watchers nearby. You walk like the world owes you space. Look at you, pretending you're better than the rest of us. Eleanor's eyes didn't flinch. Her gaze met the woman's, not in challenge, but in steadiness. The stillness she held was not weakness. It was defiance made of granite. The silence unnerved Connie more than any argument could. Her body shifted. Her hands flexed at her sides. A smirk twitched and failed. She stepped closer. Then, with the sudden sharpness of a snake strike, she reached down and yanked the cane from Eleanor's hand. It happened too fast for most to process. One moment, Eleanor stood with her cane. The next it was in Connie's hand. And then came the sound. A dry, intentional crack. Wood split clean in the middle, the lower half falling like a broken wing onto the gravel. Eleanor's hand still hung in the air for a second, reaching for something that no longer existed. The moment of confusion passed swiftly, and then came understanding. Connie tossed the top half of the cane to the ground beside its splintered twin. Her expression was flat, not triumphant. Just, done. like someone who had completed a task long overdue in her mind. And then she turned and walked away. Not rushed, not nervous, just the slow, stiff walk of someone confident there would be no consequences. Eleanor didn't move. She didn't cry out. She didn't chase after the woman. Her hand lowered. Her shoulders didn't sag. Instead, she lowered herself carefully to the edge of the bench near the path, slowly and without aid, like someone reacquainting themselves with gravity. She picked up the broken halves of her cane, one in each hand, and studied them. She didn't cry. The tears belonged to someone who had just been hurt. Eleanor had passed through that place decades ago. Now, when these moments came, she didn't bleed. She remembered. She filed the moment beside others like it. Different faces, same hatred. People had seen it happen. 3 joggers had slowed down during the confrontation, then sped up when the cane hit the ground. A middle-aged woman with headphones had watched the entire thing from 20 feet away. A man walking his dog had turned away just as Connie passed by him, her hands empty. No one helped. No one intervened. No one spoke. Phones stayed in pockets. Voices stayed silent. The shame that followed wasn't just Connie's to carry. It was collective. But someone had seen it all. Not just seen, but witnessed, recorded, and held it in their memory like evidence. From across the clearing, behind the shade of a tall oak tree, a man lowered his phone. He had not moved during the entire exchange. He had not called out, not stepped in, not yet. He had watched. His expression wasn't angry. It was focused, measured, intent. Shaquille O'Neal, standing tall in his gray hoodie and sweatpants, held the phone by his side like a quiet instrument of truth. The footage on the screen blinked back at him. No filters, no spin, just the raw, quiet cruelty of what had unfolded under blue skies and wilting civility. This wasn't just about a cane. This was about what people pretend not to see. And Shaq didn't pretend, not anymore. From the other side of the clearing, just beyond the reach of sunlight that spilled through the oak branches, a figure finally moved. He had been standing still for minutes, unmoving, a silent observer hidden by shadow and stillness. He didn't speak. He didn't call attention. He simply stepped forward, phone in hand, held not like a weapon, but like evidence. And he was not just any man. He was Shaquille O'Neal. Though here in this quiet park with no lights and no courts, he was simply Big Shaq, a presence of calm gravity and focused intent. His hoodie hung loose over his frame, the fabric shifting slightly in the breeze. His sweatpants were plain. His sneakers were scuffed. There were no cameras, no entourage, no lights, only the quiet buzz of the phone in his hand. Screen glowing, the video still running. The moment he had captured from the confrontation to the snap of Eleanor's cane now lived in that device, unedited, unfiltered, impossible to deny. Shaq didn't rush. He walked slowly, purposefully, like someone who knew the weight of presence. People turned to glance, a few recognizing him, most too distracted to place the face without the uniform or the media context. But he didn't seek recognition. That wasn't why he was there. Not today. Eleanor sat on the bench still, her eyes watching his approach with cautious curiosity. There was no fear in her gaze, but neither was there expectation. She had seen enough of the world to know that not all who approach are there to help, even those who mean well. Shaq stopped a few feet in front of her. He didn't speak right away. He didn't ask if she was okay, because he knew that question, more often than not, was a subtle insult. Instead, he lowered himself onto the bench beside her, the wood creaking slightly under his size. He held out the phone, still recording, not toward her, but out at the path where Connie had disappeared. "I got it all," he said, voice low, like someone who knew this wasn't the first time and wouldn't be the last. "All of it." Eleanor's eyes flicked toward the phone, then back to his face. She gave a small nod, not of gratitude, not yet, but acknowledgement. She understood what that meant, that someone had not looked away, that someone had chosen to see. Shaq exhaled, slowly, as if letting go of something heavier than breath. He looked around the park, at the people now pretending not to notice him, at the ones who had frozen mid-step when they realized who he was. But the attention meant little to him here. He wasn't in this park for fame. He was here for the truth. What most people didn't know, what he had carefully kept out of headlines and away from interviews, was that for the past year, Shaq had been quietly filming, not games, not highlight reels, but moments like this. He called the project Still Seen, A private, self-funded effort to document the subtler, quieter acts of racism that unfolded in everyday spaces, the ones that rarely made the news because they didn't involve blood or broken glass. Just broken dignity. He hadn't told the press, hadn't posted about it. No hashtags, no self-congratulations. Just raw footage, stored in encrypted drives, sorted and time-stamped. He didn't film to go viral. He filmed because silence had become unbearable. Shaq had seen too many versions of this moment across his life. As a child in military housing, as a college athlete, as an NBA icon walking through hotel lobbies, in cities that pretended not to recognize him when he wasn't smiling, and now as a man with the power to be invisible in plain sight, because people rarely expected someone like him to notice what happened in the margins. But he did. And he had made a decision. He wouldn't fight with fists. He wouldn't preach. He would observe, record, and preserve. Not for the internet, but for something greater. A collection of truth, waiting for the right time. And now, watching Eleanor cradle the cracked halves of her cane like they were parts of someone she loved. Shaq felt that time shifting. Something about this felt different. Maybe it was the blatant cruelty in the sunshine. Maybe it was the crowd that chose to vanish into silence. Or maybe it was Eleanor, the way she didn't demand justice, didn't cry, didn't rage, just stared at the world like someone who had seen it fail too many times, and no longer expected better. Shaq leaned back on the bench, hands clasped together in front of him. "You mind if I sit a while?" Eleanor shrugged softly, the kind of gesture that said, "You can stay if you're not here to waste time." He stayed. A few minutes passed, the park noise returning slowly like background static. A jogger passed. A child called for their parent. The moment had ended, but the tension clung to the air like smoke. Shaq looked at his phone again, watched the playback. The angle was clear, the sound sharp. Connie's words, the snap of the cane, Eleanor's silent defiance. It was all there. Shaq turned to Eleanor. "I've been filming things like this. Not for likes, not for money, just to make sure it's not erased." Eleanor didn't smile, but her eyes held something softer now. Not approval, but recognition. She had lived long enough to know when someone was sincere. Shaq continued, "I don't usually step in. I just capture it. But something about today." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. They both understood what he meant. Some acts are too deliberate to ignore. Some silences scream too loud to leave alone. He saved the footage, powered off the phone, and slid it into his pocket. He looked at Eleanor again, not as a victim, but as a survivor who had just written another painful chapter in a book no one wanted to read. Then he said quietly, "We'll make sure they see this one. Not just Connie. All of them." And for the first time since the cane had broken, Eleanor's lips parted in something close to a smile. It didn't reach her eyes. But it didn't need to. It was enough. Shaq stood, nodded once, and began to walk. Not toward fame, not toward the camera, but toward truth, captured quietly, carried deliberately, and ready to be shared. The sun had begun its slow drift westward, casting longer shadows across the gravel and softening the harsh edges of the day. The park had thinned out, and with each passing moment, the sounds of movement faded into the hum of cicadas and the rustling of leaves. Shaq remained seated beside Eleanor, their bench positioned slightly off the main path now, a quiet island in a public sea. People still passed, glancing quickly then looking away. But for these two, time had paused. Eleanor had not said much when Shaq sat beside her. Her silence wasn't dismissive, it was deliberate, like someone who had learned that speaking wasn't always the same as being heard. But now, her fingers moved slowly over the broken cane in her lap, tracing its grain as if remembering it more than simply holding it. And then, as if sensing it was the right moment, she began to speak, not with emotion, but with clarity. "I was born in 1947, she said, eyes not meeting his but focused instead on the splintered wood, "in Augusta, Georgia. You ever been to a place where the sidewalks tell you who you can and can't be?" Shaq said nothing, only nodded slightly. She continued, steady. "We lived behind the old mill, red dirt roads and clotheslines, like flags of survival. Daddy was a school janitor. Mama worked in the kitchen of a church that didn't let us worship there." There was no bitterness in her tone, no cracked emotion, only history, recited with the calm of someone who had carried it for decades. "They called it separate but equal, but it never felt equal. I used to walk past a park like this, just like this, where colored children weren't allowed. I'd stop at the fence sometimes and pretend I could hear the swing chains squeaking. She paused, lifting the longer piece of her cane and holding it upright. The grain caught the sun, highlighting initials carved carefully along the shaft.
You see this? That's my husband's work. George Briggs.
Lost his sight in '82. Something in his blood turned against him. They said it would take his eyes, but they didn't say it would take his joy. Her voice remained even, but there was a shift in her posture, a kind of reverence, quiet and deeply rooted. He carved it for our 25th anniversary, said if he couldn't see me walk anymore, he'd at least know I was safe doing it. Shaq looked at the initials, clean and symmetrical. The mark of someone who used touch like sight. He didn't speak, just listened. Really listened. George passed in '93. Stroke hit him while he was reading Braille scripture. They said he went quick. I was glad for that. We buried him with his tools, except the blade he used for this. She tapped the cane gently. I kept that in a box. Still smells like cedar. She adjusted her coat slightly, as if shaking off the weight of the memory but not letting go of it. Her eyes shifted to Shaq, finally meeting him. You ever carry something so long it just becomes part of your walk? Shaq nodded. His throat tightened, but he let her keep the silence between them. It wasn't awkward. It was earned. I've had people spit at my feet, she said. I've been denied jobs, questioned in stores, told I don't belong. But today hurt different. She looked back toward the path, where Connie had vanished not an hour before. Because now they don't call you a slur. They just erase your dignity, in front of a crowd that pretends it isn't happening. Shaq leaned forward, elbows on knees. He understood what she meant, not because he had lived her exact life, but because his own version of it had played out under different lights. Hotel clerks who went stiff when he walked in. Restaurant managers who assumed he'd want something extra. Police eyes that lingered longer than necessary. I used to think being seen was enough, he said, voice low. That if we just caught it on camera, showed the world, that something would change. Eleanor turned her head toward him. That's how I used to feel about marching. He exhaled slowly, their shared pause thicker now, with something unspoken. Not regret, but awakening. It's not about being seen, she added. It's about being believed. And too many of us still aren't. Shaq stared ahead, jaw tight. His phone sat in his pocket, holding the footage, holding the evidence. But evidence didn't change hearts. It only pressed them to admit what they already knew and refused to face. I started this project to collect moments, he said. To show the hidden racism, the ones that don't get headlines. But maybe I've been too quiet. She didn't respond. She didn't need to. Shaq understood something had shifted. He wasn't just an observer anymore. He wasn't there to quietly document pain. He was being called to elevate it, to do something that mattered after the recording stopped. What happened to me today? Eleanor said, breaking the pause. That's not new. That's not rare. But the fact that you stayed, that's different. She looked back at the cane. This meant something to me. Not because it helped me walk, but because it reminded me I didn't do it alone. Shaq looked at the broken halves again. He thought of all the people who had told him to stick to basketball. All the moments he could have stayed comfortable and disconnected. All the faces like Eleanor's, in parks and buses and banks, carrying grace in the face of indifference. He rose slowly, as if the decision itself required gravity. I'll fix it, he said, nodding at the cane. Eleanor didn't argue. She just nodded once, a gesture that said, you understand now. And he did. This wasn't about a broken cane. It was about a legacy being splintered in broad daylight, and someone finally deciding that seeing it wasn't enough. It had to be remembered. It had to be answered. It started with a quiet upload.
No press release, no hashtags, no demand for justice scribbled in all caps. Just a time-stamped video, 3 minutes and 17 seconds long, posted to a nondescript account under the name Still Seen. It showed Eleanor's steady walk, Connie's intrusion, the confrontation, the crack of the cane, and the silence of the crowd. No voiceovers, no edits, no dramatic music, just the truth, raw and dispassionate, framed exactly as it happened.
Within hours, the ripple turned tidal. The video spread like fire on dry grass. First, it hit local activist circles, groups that had been cataloging quiet acts of racial aggression for years, hungry for footage that couldn't be denied. Then it spilled into national feeds, trending on platforms Shaq never used publicly. People reshared it with hashtags like Shand with Eleanor and Broken Cane Justice. Within 24 hours, major networks picked it up. Commentators argued over every second of the footage, dissecting Eleanor's stillness like it was strategy, Connie's sneer like it was circumstantial. But with attention came distortion. By day 3, anonymous accounts flooded the web with conspiracy theories. Edited clips framed Eleanor as confrontational. Others insisted the video was staged, part of an orchestrated campaign to smear a good family's name. Some posts even claimed Shaq had hired actors, that the entire scene was part of a documentary hoax. And when internet sleuths identified Connie Harland as the wife of Councilman Dale Harland, a second storm erupted, one that threatened not just reputations but institutions. Inside a modest brick building on the east side of Atlanta, Shaq and his small team gathered around a long table. Maps, laptops, documents, and a whiteboard filled with scribbled names and connections crowded the room. Shaq stood at the head, his expression unreadable, arms folded as his team relayed the news. "She's insulated," said Malik Grant, a sharp-eyed activist in his late 20s. "Dale Harland's been on the city council for 12 years. He's got friends in zoning, education, housing, you name it. They're trying to quarantine the narrative before it spreads too deep. They've already submitted takedown notices to 3 platforms," added Rowan Elkins, a former civil rights attorney who now helped Shaq handle legal fallout, claiming defamation and harassment. "They want this video scrubbed before it does real damage." Lucille O'Neill stood in the corner, arms crossed, quiet but watchful. She didn't speak often during these meetings, but when she did, the room listened. Now her silence was weighty. She was reading the room, the rhythm of it, the way only a mother could. Her eyes flicked to her son, who hadn't said a word since the meeting began. "It's not about the video," Shaq finally said. "It's about what it threatens to expose." He walked over to the board, tapped his finger against a circle around Connie's name. "She's not just some racist in a park. She's connected to a machine that's been quiet for too long. We didn't just catch her. We caught a system slipping." Rowan nodded. "And now the system's reacting. Fast." Eleanor, meanwhile, had become an unwilling icon. News outlets sent vans to her neighborhood. Reporters knocked on her door. Some polite, others persistent. Photos from her high school yearbook were dredged up and circulated. Online tributes poured in from strangers, branding her a modern Rosa Parks. But Eleanor hadn't asked for any of it. She had refused interviews, declined televised statements. Her words to Shaq echoed louder with each headline. "I didn't come to that park to make a point. I came to walk." Shaq watched it unfold with a tightness in his chest that he hadn't felt in years. Not during championship games, not during career-ending injuries. This was something different. This was what it felt like to hold truth in your hands and realize the world might crush it before it ever meant something. He spent late nights reviewing the footage again and again. Not because he doubted it, but because he wanted to feel the exact moment the crowd looked away. He watched their faces blur and turn. Watched the moment the collective conscience failed. That failure haunted him more than Connie's cruelty. Lucille spoke up at last. "You knew they'd come for you when you stopped being neutral." Shaq didn't look at her. "I wasn't neutral, Mama. I was quiet. Same thing, baby. To them it is." Malik spun his laptop toward Shaq. "There's something else. One of my contacts found city grant applications. Connie filed last year for a community enrichment program. It was approved, but the organization doesn't exist. The address on the paperwork is a P.O. box in her sister's name. There's money in this. Misused funds. Covered trails." A beat of silence followed. Shaq leaned in, eyes narrowed. "So we're not just dealing with racism in the park." Rowan nodded. "We're dealing with public fraud, political shielding, and a trail they thought no one would follow." Shaq stood back. He thought about Eleanor sitting on that bench, her broken cane in her lap, not flinching, not raging, just absorbing another injustice like skin absorbing sunlight, slowly, deeply, and without choice. The choice, now, was his. He had built Still Seen to stay anonymous, to document without interference. But something about this, about Eleanor, about Connie, about the silence of the crowd, pushed him beyond quiet. "They want it buried," he said. "They want the story to disappear into noise and counter-noise. But we're not letting that happen." Malik leaned forward. "You ready for the blowback?" Shaq didn't blink. "It's already here." Outside, the city carried on like it always had. Drivers honking at intersections, coffee shops buzzing with casual conversation. But inside that room, something new had taken root. resolve. Not the kind that shouts into microphones, but the kind that walks steady, records everything and refuses to flinch. Because once the truth is seen, the real question becomes, who's willing to carry it? The office air felt heavier than usual. Morning light pushed through the windows, thin and reluctant, as though even the sun hesitated to touch what Shaq's team was about to uncover. It wasn't just a video anymore. It wasn't just Eleanor's cane or Connie Harlan's malice. What they were dealing with now lived beneath clean sidewalks and painted curbs, tangled beneath layers of policy, paperwork, and silence. Malik stood at the center of the room, his laptop projecting grainy footage onto the wall. The timestamp read, HOA West Ridge Private Cam 04/110:42 a.m. The angle was high, possibly from a mounted camera on a community lamppost. In the clip, Connie Harlan stood on her porch, arms folded, as two sharply dressed men approached her door. They didn't look like neighbors. One held a folder, the other glanced nervously around before knocking. Connie opened the door, barely said a word. She stepped aside, and they entered without hesitation. The date was the day after the park incident. City suits, Malik muttered. That's Garrett Stromer, assistant city administrator. Second guy is his aide. I think. He did a few press ops with Councilman Harland last year. Shaq studied the footage with arms crossed. He didn't blink, didn't speak. His jaw was set like stone. Rowan, seated beside Malik, leaned forward, adjusting her glasses. It means they knew, probably before the video even went public. They were managing the fallout before there was public fallout, which means someone in their office flagged it internally. Someone recognized her. Lucille stood by the window, her arms crossed, eyes distant. She hadn't said much all morning. Now she turned, her voice even. This ain't new, you know. These kinds of folks, they don't just bury bodies, they bury records, they bury voices, and they do it so long. People forget they're even supposed to dig. Shaq kept his eyes on the screen. The footage looped. Connie's front door opened. The officials disappeared inside. The door closed. Then black. That's not the only thing we found, Malik said. He clicked through tabs on his screen, opening a document stamped with the city's logo. 3 previous complaints. One from a mail carrier. One from a neighbor's teenage daughter. One from a church volunteer canvassing in her neighborhood. Racial harassment? Rowan asked. Verbal, each time. Same tone, same language. One of them involved her chasing a girl off her lawn with a garden rake. Nothing ever escalated far enough to involve the police. But in all 3 cases, formal statements were filed. In all 3 cases were sealed. Shaq asked, his voice sharp now, cutting through the room like the edge of a blade. Malik nodded. Settled. Expunged. Or marked. Administratively closed. Not one reached a hearing. Lucille sighed. They got someone cleaning her path every time she stumbles. And they think no one notices because they're cleaning in daylight, pretending it's maintenance, not cover-up. Rowan sat back in her chair, thoughtful. The city's involved, not just in reputation management, in erasure. They're protecting a woman who's become a liability because exposure would mean accountability. Shaq walked to the board at the far wall, where their collected notes had begun to sprawl into a web of names, dates, relationships. He drew a red line between Connie Harlan's name and Councilman Dale Harland. Then another from Dale to Garrett Stromer. Then a third, newer line, linking Stromer to the Office of Municipal Ethics, a connection that shouldn't have existed. This isn't just about Connie anymore, he said. This is about how deep this city's willing to go to keep their version of peace intact. Lucille's voice came from behind him, quiet but firm. You step further in, you're gonna find more than just rot. You're gonna find names you've shaken hands with. People you thought were harmless. Friends in suits with poison in their pens. Shaq turned to face her. Then maybe it's time we start naming them. She didn't flinch, but she did step closer. Just remember, some fights pull more than your name. They pull your soul, your rest, your spirit. You ready to give all that? There was no dramatic pause. No grand declaration. Shaq didn't need to summon courage. It was already rooted in him. The kind that didn't speak itself into being, but simply existed because it had to. He looked back at the footage, then back at his mother. I'm already in, he said. I don't walk halfway through doors. Malik handed him a folder. Inside was a printed report, a confidential complaint summary signed by a city clerk whose name had been blacked out. But the language was clear. Incident occurred at Harland residence. Allegations of misconduct. Recommend private resolution. The date was 2 years ago. No further documentation followed. We think she's being used, Rowan said. Or at least tolerated. Because her husband delivers results. And to them, protecting their own means protecting the illusion that everything's functioning just fine. Shaq read through the summary. The same cold words. The same institutional euphemisms. Allegations. Perceived aggression. Contextual ambiguity. All ways to say we heard what happened, and we chose not to care. He closed the folder and set it down. No more ambiguity, he said. Lucille's eyes stayed on him. She could see the shift happening. The line her son had quietly stepped over. The one that turned witnesses into warriors. What's the move? Malik asked. Shaq looked at the red lines he'd drawn. We published the full list. The complaints. The sealed files. The video of the city officials at her house. No commentary. No framing. Just the truth. Out in the open. And if they come after you directly? Rowan asked. Shaq shrugged. Then they proved the point. Outside the room, the world continued. Cars passed. Children walked home from school. Birds gathered on telephone wires, unaware of the corruption stitched into the concrete below. But inside that room, the silence before the next storm had begun. Not fear. Focus. The message arrived through a burner email. Unsigned and vague. The subject line read, I have something. Please don't ignore me. At first glance it looked like another piece of digital noise. One of many that flooded Shaq's inbox after the video went viral. But the second line of the email struck with quiet force. My name is Delaney Price. I'm Connie Harlan's daughter. Shaq sat at the edge of his desk, phone in one hand, the message burning into him. He read it twice, then a third time. No threats, no accusations, just a request to meet in person, not at an office, not on a call, but somewhere neutral, somewhere no cameras could follow. She named the place herself, Denton Park Greenhouse, closed on Wednesdays, known for its privacy and worn charm. The time noon sharp. He didn't tell his full team. Just Malik and Rowan. Lucille wasn't thrilled, but she understood. Sometimes the snake's child carries the antidote, she had said before he left. Sometimes they carry more venom. At noon, the greenhouse smelled like lemon balm and soil. Sunlight streamed through dust-smudged panes, catching the air in warm shafts. A staff member let Shaq in and disappeared through the rear, leaving him alone among long wooden tables, filled with potted herbs and flowering vines. A wind chime clinked lazily above the door. He didn't wait long. She entered 10 minutes late, wearing a loose army green jacket, black jeans and a messenger bag slung tightly across her chest. Her face held echoes of her mother's sharp cheekbones and narrowed jaw, but her posture was different, tense, coiled in the kind of way people looked when they expected to be dismissed. She had her blonde hair pulled back in a messy knot, her eyes shadowed not by makeup, but exhaustion. You really came, she said, stopping several feet away. Shaq gave a slow nod. You said you had something to show me. I do. She hesitated, then added. But I didn't think you'd show up alone. I didn't. Delaney's eyes flicked to the corners, scanning the greenhouse. Security outside, Shaq said calmly. They stay put unless I signal. She took a slow breath and moved closer, careful but deliberate, pulling a small flash drive from her pocket and setting it on the table between them. Then she reached into her bag and produced a thick journal, leather-bound, marked with sticky notes and highlighter tags. She laid it down beside the drive. My mother, she began, has been two people my entire life. There's the public version, tight smile, spotless reputation, church fundraisers. And then there's the private version, cold, controlled, obsessed with order and rage she can't name. Shaq watched her but said nothing. I was raised in it, Delaney continued. The silence, the glances, the things she'd mutter under her breath when we passed certain people on the street. The way she snapped when she thought no one important was listening. My dad never stopped her. He called it managing optics. I called it fear. Her voice cracked slightly, but she pushed through. I started recording her 2 years ago. Not because I thought it would matter, but because I wanted to remember I wasn't crazy. That the things she said behind closed doors were real. That someone else might believe me one day. Shaq looked down at the drive. What's on it? Audio files, phone calls, voicemails, stuff from her conversations with officials, Garrett Stromer included. She thought she was cleaning up the HOA, But really she was laundering favors. There's even a clip from 2 nights ago. Her gloating that nothing will stick because it's all noise and sympathy. Shaq's expression didn't shift. Why give it to me? Delaney looked down at her hands. Because when I saw the video I saw that cane. And I saw my mother, unmoved, proud of what she'd done. I used to think if I cut ties, that was enough. That if I stayed away from her and refused her money, I wasn't part of the damage anymore. But I was wrong. She pushed the journal toward him next. Everything she never deleted. Her thoughts, her lists, notes on people in the neighborhood. It's chilling. She keeps records like a strategist, not a housewife. These aren't just personal opinions. It's political targeting. Obsession level. Shaq picked up the journal, thumbing through pages thick with annotations. A list of community members. Notes about property infractions. Annotations like watch her loud at HOA meeting. And husband too friendly with that dark-skinned girl from across town. This is more than prejudice, he said finally. It's targeted. Delaney nodded. And protected. She took a step back, visibly shaken. I've spent most of my life ashamed of my last name. But this is me trying to step out from under it. Or is it insurance? Shaq asked, his voice calm but loaded. Delaney's eyes didn't flinch. I wouldn't blame you if you thought so. He studied her. The way she stood without shifting. The way she didn't interrupt. There was no pride in her posture, just burden. That kind of heaviness couldn't be faked. People are gonna say you're flipping on your family to save your own face, he said. I already flipped on them a long time ago, she replied. This is just the first time I'm doing it out loud. They stood in the stillness of the greenhouse, the sun warming the space between them. Shaq weighed the risk, the possible setup, the media spin if this went south. But the truth sat in front of him, physical and real. I'll verify everything, he said. Of course, she replied. You should. She picked up her bag and turned to leave, then paused at the door. I don't want credit. I just want the noise to stop. I want that woman on the bench to know someone else saw it too. Shaq gave a slight nod. She'll know. Delaney left without another word. The door swung shut behind her, the wind chime above it clinking once before falling still. Shaq stood in the greenhouse, holding a flash drive in one hand and a journal in the other. The silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It was loaded. The auditorium didn't feel like a courtroom, but it might as well have been. It was a community center usually reserved for town halls and charity galas, now transformed into a crucible of reckoning. The folding chairs had been arranged in rows, facing a modest stage. No banners, no flags, just a long wooden table, 3 microphones, a projector screen, and a single camera in the back operated by Shaq's most trusted tech, Malik. Shaq had insisted on neutrality. No media crews, no social media live streams, just a closed room with open doors. Anyone from the community was free to attend. The only rule, no interruptions. This wasn't about outrage. This was about truth. Plain, undisturbed, unedited. By the time the hearing began, over 200 people had filtered in. Neighbors, council staff, students, shop owners. Some came curious, others skeptical. A few came bracing for a fight that wouldn't come. Shaq stood off to the side of the stage, not seated with the speakers. He wasn't the center of this. He had created the space, not the story. That distinction mattered. Eleanor Briggs sat in the front row. She wore a navy dress, plain and pressed, with her new cane beside her. It had been hand-carved by a woodworker from Shaq's foundation, made from hickory and etched with George Briggs's initials along the curve. She didn't lean on it when she stood and walked toward the microphone. She didn't clear her throat or fumble. She just stood there, shoulders back, hands folded calmly in front of her. When I walked into that park, I didn't expect to leave with a broken cane, but I also didn't expect to leave with a broken silence. She paused. I have lived long enough to know that the things people don't say are sometimes more dangerous than the ones they do. That woman didn't call me anything. She didn't need to. She wanted to make me feel small. What she didn't know is that I stopped shrinking a long time ago. There was no applause. Shaq had asked everyone not to clap, not out of disrespect, but because he wanted the words to linger without punctuation. Eleanor stepped back, returned to her seat, her expression unchanged. She hadn't spoken to shame anyone. She had spoken to leave a mark, one that couldn't be erased. Next came Delaney Price. The murmurs started, before she even reached the microphone. Some people recognized her. Others whispered fragments. That's Connie Harlan's daughter. She's the one who flipped. She wore a black turtleneck and slacks, hair pulled tight, voice trembling only for the first 5 words. "My name is Delaney Price," she said, "and I'm here because silence helped my mother hurt people. And for a long time, I thought my distance made me innocent. It didn't." She laid the journal on the table beside her. Then the flash drive. "What you'll hear today is not a confession. It's a record of what I heard, of what I read, of what I failed to stop. My mother's cruelty didn't start with Eleanor, and unless it's confronted, it won't end with her either." There was a long beat before she stepped back. Not a tear fell. Not a single plea for forgiveness passed her lips. She wasn't here for redemption. She was here for responsibility. Rowan Elkins walked up next and connected the projector. The lights dimmed slightly, the room falling into a heavy hush. Shaq stayed in the corner, arms folded, watching not the screen, but the audience. The real impact wouldn't be in the footage. It would be in their faces, as they watched it. The first clip was the original park video, the uncut version, from Eleanor's approach to the snapping of the cane. No narration, no zooms, just a moment, laid bare. Gasps rippled through the crowd, but no one spoke. Some turned their eyes away. Others leaned in, unable to believe what had unfolded in a space they thought they knew. Then came the audio. Connie's voice, sharper and private, layered with malice and entitlement. Voicemails ranting about certain neighbors who don't belong. Notes about sabotaging local projects led by Black residents. A phone call with Garrett Stromer, arranging a private visit to resolve a situation discreetly. The denial they'd all heard before was unraveling in real time. When the lights returned, the room was different. Not louder, just heavier. People shifted in their seats like the oxygen had thickened. And then quietly, she stood. Connie Harland, in a beige blouse and pencil skirt, face drained of color. She wasn't there to speak. Shaq had extended the invitation, but she'd declined to address the room. Still she had come, sat through every second. Now, she stood not to explain, but because staying seated felt impossible. Every eye turned to her. Some were angry, others simply tired. She didn't move toward the microphone. She didn't raise a hand. She just stood there, center of the weight, stripped of the shield she'd worn for decades. The silence that had once protected her now wrapped around her like a shroud. She turned and walked out. No escort. No words. No defense. And just like that, she disappeared into the crowd. The woman everyone thought they knew now. A stranger to everyone, including her daughter. As the forum concluded, Shaq stepped onto the stage for the first time. He didn't take a microphone. He simply spoke. What you saw today wasn't just about one person. It was about a pattern. One that's older than most of us in this room. We've learned to normalize silence, to explain away cruelty, to look the other way when something doesn't touch us directly. But dignity doesn't ask for spectacle. It asks for memory, for truth. He paused, scanning the room. No one here is perfect, but we're responsible. From this point forward, we can't say we didn't know. He stepped down. No applause followed, just a long rising murmur of reflection. Chairs scraping slowly. Conversations whispered instead of declared. Eleanor left without a word. Delaney followed behind her, not beside her. Shaq stayed behind, watching the people file out, changed not by anger, but by acknowledgement. Outside, dusk had settled. The air had cooled. But inside, something permanent had been planted. A kind of quiet justice that didn't demand punishment, just truth, presented without rage or distortion. The mirror had been held up, and this time, no one could look away. Fall came fast that year. The leaves changed quicker than expected, turning the parks and sidewalks into fading mosaics of red and gold. But even as the season softened the edges of the world outside, nothing about the days that followed the public hearing felt gentle. In fact, they hit harder than Shaq had braced for. And he had braced for a lot. Connie Harland's world fell first. Her husband, Councilman Dale Harland, submitted his resignation in a 3-line statement that offered no apology and no clarity, only a quiet retreat into legal silence. Local news reported it as a private matter, but everyone knew what it meant. Damage control in real time. The city's Office of Ethics launched an investigation within 48 hours, and names from Shaq's red marker board began surfacing in headlines. City contracts frozen, internal audits triggered, whispers of indictment. But while the Harlands retreated into their carefully guarded privacy, Shaq stepped into the storm, It came from all sides. A right-wing podcast falsely claimed that Shaq had doctored the video and ambushed an innocent family to build his brand. Commentators who once praised his philanthropy now painted him as a racial agitator. Anonymous online accounts flooded his social media with threats, accusations, conspiracy-laced vitriol. Headlines began shifting, not about Eleanor or Connie or corruption, but about Shaq himself. Has Big Shaq gone too far? Celebrity justice noble or narcissistic? When athletes play politics, he didn't respond. Not publicly. Not once. But inside he felt the burn. The quiet moments after the hearing had been hopeful. For a day or two, people talked about dignity, about listening, about doing better. But then the cycle shifted, because truth, no matter how heavy, is rarely allowed to rest in one place for long. People demanded new controversies, fresh outrage. And Shaq, for a growing segment of critics, became the perfect lightning rod. He sat in his office one evening, the room dim except for the soft glow of the screens. The news played silently in the background, running a loop of opinion clips while his phone vibrated on the desk. Text from Rowan, updates from Malik, and another anonymous number flooding his inbox with slurs that hadn't aged a day since the 60s. Lucille entered quietly, a warm mug of tea in one hand, a blanket folded over her arm. She set both down beside him and looked at the screens, then at her son. He hadn't looked up in minutes. "I taught you to speak when you saw something wrong," she said. "Didn't expect the world to say thank you for it." Shaq leaned back, rubbing his face with his hands, fatigue sinking into his shoulders. "I knew it'd get loud. I didn't think they'd twist it like this." "They twisted it because they're scared," Lucille said simply. "Scared of being seen. Not by cameras. By truth." He picked up the mug but didn't drink. His eyes were distant, staring into the digital firestorm he'd unintentionally walked into. "Part of me wonders if I made it worse," he said. Lucille raised a brow. "For who?" "For Eleanor. For Delaney. For people watching, hoping for something quiet and good to come out of it." Lucille pulled a chair beside him and sat. "You think justice means applause?" "No," Shaq said. "But I didn't think it would mean this much hate either. Not after everything laid out in front of them." She gave him a look only a mother could, part patience, part steel. "You still think this is about proof? Baby, people see what they want to see, even when the truth walks up and introduces itself. What you gave them wasn't comfort. You gave them accountability. That don't come with flowers." He finally drank the tea. It steadied him more than he expected. "You know," she added, after a pause, "when your daddy used to talk about marching with Dr. King, he'd say the worst part wasn't the fire hoses. It was the people who smiled at you in church and then turned their backs when the cameras left." Shaq said nothing, but her words landed deep. That quiet betrayal, the kind dressed in civility, was the storm he hadn't been prepared for. Not the rage. The apathy. "I'm not tired of fighting," he said, "but I'm tired of being the story." Lucille nodded, then shifted. "Keep telling other people's. Don't let this world turn your courage into spectacle." He looked at her. "You think I did the right thing?" She smiled. That kind of small, knowing smile that doesn't need to be big to mean something. "Justice don't ask if it's convenient. It asks if it's worth it. And you already know the answer." The silence between them settled like peace. Not relief, but resolve. The kind that digs in when everything else wants to run. Later that night, Shaq logged off, closed the tabs, shut down the noise. Instead, he pulled up a file labeled Still Seen Archives. Inside were over 100 videos, moments caught, moments overlooked, moments like Eleanor's, quiet and devastating. He clicked open a new document and titled it Echoes from the Edge. This was no longer just about exposing racism. It was about remembering who still stands when the storm comes for them. The trees had bloomed again, the early spring wind rolling through the familiar branches of a place that once bore no name beyond what the city had given it. But today, the park was different, not because the flowers were brighter or the benches newer, but because the silence that had once hidden indifference now echoed with remembrance. It had been 4 months since the public hearing. 4 months since the footage broke through carefully curated walls and planted truth where denial used to grow. The scandal that followed had unraveled with slow, deliberate weight. Connie Harlan's name disappeared from local social circles. Her husband had relocated, and no council replacement had yet been appointed. The ethics investigation was still ongoing, stuck in the machinery of internal reviews and redacted documents. but the city, at least on its surface, was trying to move forward. And part of that movement stood in bronze just beyond the edge of the duck pond. A modest plaque, surrounded by a ring of daffodils, resting at the foot of a restored garden path. Eleanor Briggs Park. The name was simple. The ceremony understated. No banners, no televised ribbon cutting. Just a quiet unveiling, attended by a small, carefully chosen group. Eleanor hadn't wanted speeches. She'd asked for one thing only: that the path where her cane had been broken be repaved with stone instead of gravel, and that benches be added on both sides. So they were. She walked that path now, cane in hand, the newly carved wood tapping gently against the fresh stone. It was her second time through it that week. Her steps were measured but not slow. At 76, she moved with the kind of pace that said, "I've earned this space." The cane glinted in the sunlight, rebuilt from the same wood, but now reinforced and etched with a silver inlay that read "Still Seen," a gift from the team that had stayed long after the cameras left, from the man who hadn't tried to save her, but simply refused to forget her. Shaq wasn't at the unveiling, not because he wasn't invited, but because he asked not to be mentioned. The plaque made no reference to him. There was no credit, no nod to the video, no thanks to, only the name of a woman who had stood, endured, and walked on. Instead, Shaq was 3 states away that day, seated quietly in a dim office in a repurposed library building, now home to a fledgling nonprofit called Stand Quietly. It was a lean operation, 4 full-time staff, 3 part-time volunteers, and a network of freelance contributors across the country. Their mission was deceptively simple: to document the moments that slipped through news cycles. No loud campaigns, no branded merchandise, just stories, curated with precision, told without spectacle. Incidents that often began with a look, a word, a denial of service, a suspicious call to police, the kinds of racism too quiet to trend, but too real to ignore. Shaq had funded it entirely out of pocket, turning down all endorsement offers tied to the project. He didn't want it owned. He didn't want it packaged. Delaney Price now ran the editorial side of the nonprofit, her name slowly rebuilding in spaces once closed to her. She worked long hours, sometimes too long, but she said the work made her feel cleaner, like she was finally doing something with the burden she'd carried for so long. Her tone was sharper these days, less apologetic, not angry, just clear. She'd stopped asking to be forgiven. She'd started asking what needed fixing. One of the walls in the office was lined with still images, frozen frames from captured incidents. No captions, no identifiers, just moments. A man denied entry to a bank while others were waved in. A school hallway where a student was forced to empty her bag while her white peers were. A woman standing outside her own home, as a security guard, asked for proof she lived there. Shaq stood in front of the wall often, sometimes in silence, sometimes scribbling notes on a legal pad he never let anyone else read. He hadn't stopped filming. He went out often now, never announcing himself, always quiet, sometimes in a hoodie, sometimes in plain clothes, with a baseball cap pulled low. He didn't need to be recognized. In fact, he hoped not to be, because the power wasn't in being seen. It was in seeing others. One afternoon, Lucille came to visit. She brought banana pudding and left without staying too long. But before she did, she walked the full length of the image wall. She stopped at one photo, an older black man in a wheelchair, looking up at a police officer who was pointing away from a bus stop. She tapped the frame lightly. "He got a name?" Delaney, seated nearby, answered. "Louis Mayfield." They told him the route didn't allow medical equipment, even though it did. Lucille frowned. "Don't erase people. Print names." Shaq nodded from across the room. By next week, every photo had a nameplate beneath it. In the months that followed, Stand Quietly began to catch quiet momentum. Not viral, not explosive, but steady. Universities requested use of the footage in ethics classes. Social workers began referencing the materials in bias trainings. Even a few city boards quietly reached out for private briefings. No fanfare, no grand transformations, just small acknowledgments, scattered like seeds across a dry field. And still, Eleanor walked. Once a week, she visited the park bearing her name. Sometimes with a niece, sometimes alone. Once, she sat on the bench and spoke with a young boy who asked her why the ground looked different in her section. She told him it was because something had been broken there once, and now it was stronger. He asked if she meant the stone. She smiled and said, Yes, that too. She never stopped carrying the cane. Not because she needed it every day, but because she chose to. Because it reminded her of what had been taken, and what had been returned with care. One quiet Thursday, just as the sun began to dip, a tall figure stood under the trees on the park's edge, hoodie pulled low, phone held steady. Big Shaq, watching through the lens. He didn't film Eleanor. He filmed the path. The families walking through it. The bench, now often occupied by teenagers doing homework. The flower beds planted in a circle around the plaque. The man helping his mother up from her seat. The girl picking up trash near the playground. He recorded because one day, someone would say none of this had happened. That Eleanor Briggs was just a name on a plaque. That racism was over. That the silence had always been peaceful. Never complicit. Shaq knew better. He filmed because the truth needs caretakers. As the wind picked up, he turned off the camera, packed it into a worn bag, stepped back into the tree line. The frame lingered on the park, on the bench, on the plaque. And then the story closed with a voice. Not loud, not triumphant, just clear. Sometimes the biggest voices don't shout. They just stand and see. What you saw wasn't just a story. It's a reflection. The question is, what will you do when silence tries to speak louder than truth? Stay aware. Stay uncomfortable. Stay present. Because the next moment that matters might unfold right in front of you. And this time someone needs to stand. Not louder, just stronger.